A successful businessman lost his voice after an accident and let everyone around him believe he'd lost his mind too. Until the caregiver hired to help him started saying things out loud that she never meant for anyone to hear, and he held on to every word. Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Fraser Dunlop hadn't spoken in 26 days, and for the first 19 of those, he genuinely couldn't. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of night that arrives early on the Pacific coast, dark and salt-smelling and indifferent. A crane collapsed at one of his Vancouver development sites. He'd gone to check on the crew himself, the way he always did when something felt off, and the scaffolding gave way without warning. He woke up 4 days later in St. Paul's Hospital with 2 cracked ribs, a fractured collarbone, and no voice. The doctors explained it carefully. Traumatic laryngeal injury, compounded by swelling in the vocal cords. Possibly temporary, possibly not. They couldn't say, and they were honest about not being able to say, which Fraser appreciated more than the false reassurances his visitors offered in the days that followed. His business partner Duncan Hale visited on the 5th day. Duncan, 43, silver-tongued and perfectly groomed, sat at Fraser's bedside and said everything a best friend of 15 years was supposed to say. He squeezed Fraser's hand. He called him brother. He said the company was holding together, that Fraser shouldn't worry about a thing. Fraser watched him. Duncan's left leg bounced under the chair the entire time. His fiancée Portia arrived an hour later, bringing flowers he hadn't asked for and a perfume that made his head ache. She kissed his forehead and spoke in the soft, patient voice a person uses with someone they no longer expect much from. "You rest," she said. "That's all you have to do." Fraser watched her too. By the time he was discharged, his voice hadn't come back. The specialist said it might return in weeks or months or not at all. There were options: surgery, therapy, technology, but they'd explore those once the swelling fully resolved. For now, quiet, patience, a whiteboard and a marker. He took the whiteboard. He didn't use it much. The drive home to West Vancouver was long and gray, the mountains swallowed in cloud. Fraser sat in the back of the car and watched the water and thought about Duncan's bouncing leg. He thought about Portia's careful voice. He thought about the documents that had gone missing from his office 2 weeks before the accident. The board meeting scheduled without his knowledge. The look the two of them exchanged in the hospital hallway when they believed he was asleep. He hadn't been asleep. And so, quietly, without writing it down on any whiteboard, Fraser Dunlop made a decision. He could communicate if he wanted to, writing, gesturing, the whiteboard. But he was going to keep people guessing about exactly how much he understood. Let them be comfortable. Let them forget to be careful. Let them show him, with their own mouths, what they were. He hadn't been this still in 20 years of building a company. It turned out silence was good for watching. Brynn Alcott arrived on a Monday morning with a canvas bag, a travel mug of tea, and her sister's voice still in her ears. Jess, 14 and stubborn as river ice, had stood in the doorway of their apartment in North Vancouver and told Brynn she didn't need a babysitter while Brynn was at work. Brynn had told her she wasn't getting one. She was getting a neighbor who would check in twice. Jess was going to do her homework, and that was the end of it. Jess had said fine, in the particular way that meant nothing about it was fine. Brynn had kissed her on the head and caught the bus. She was 28, certified as a personal support worker, and she had been her sister's legal guardian for 3 years, since a car accident on the Trans-Canada had taken their parents and left the two of them to figure out what came next. She was good at figuring out what came next. She was considerably less good at sleeping. The Dunlop house was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. It sat back from the road in a neighborhood of careful hedges and quiet money, cedar and glass and a view of the water that probably had its own name in the listing. The housekeeper, a compact and efficient woman named Miss Pelletier, met her at the door and explained the situation in 3 sentences. The boss couldn't speak. The doctors said to keep things calm, and the last aid had lasted 4 days before asking not to come back. Brynn said she understood. She met Fraser Dunlop that afternoon. He came down the stairs the way someone moves when they've recently learned not to trust their own body. Measured, one hand on the railing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark circles under sharp eyes and a jaw set in an expression Brynn initially read as anger before she revised it to something more like controlled exhaustion. He wore a gray sweater and held a whiteboard with nothing written on it. He looked at her. Brynn smiled. "Hi, I'm Brynn. I'll be helping out while you recover." He said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. "I'll get out of your way," she added. "I just wanted to put a face to the name." He turned and went back toward the kitchen without any acknowledgement at all, the whiteboard hanging at his side. Brynn stood in the hallway and thought, all right then, she'd worked with harder. The first week was quiet in the way that large empty houses are quiet. Sound doesn't disappear, it simply becomes more deliberate. Mrs. Pelletier's footsteps on the hardwood, rain on the windows, the particular silence of a person in a room who has decided not to speak. Fraser was everywhere and nowhere. He worked at his desk in the study, reviewing documents. She could see the light under the door at all hours. He sat on the back deck in the mornings with coffee and watched the water. He ignored her with consistent thoroughness. Brynn, for her part, talked. She'd learned it years ago from a supervisor who'd told her that patients who seemed non-responsive often weren't, not really, and that silence from a caregiver was lonelier than almost anything. So she narrated. Not intrusively. She wasn't a running commentary, but she talked while she worked. She told him the forecast. She mentioned something funny Jess had texted her. She said the soup she was reheating was Mrs. Pelletier's recipe and it smelled incredible. She asked his opinion on things she didn't expect answers to. He never answered. But he stopped leaving the room when she came in, which she counted as something. On the 8th day, Brynn was reorganizing the book's shelves in the study. He'd pointed at them with a vague gesture she'd interpreted as, "Do something with these." And she'd been talking about nothing in particular when she said, without meaning to, "My sister got her diagnosis confirmed last week. The specialist in Calgary thinks it's manageable, but manageable is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, you know?" She stopped. Fraser looked up from the papers on his desk. "Sorry," Brynn said. "That's not your concern. You don't need my stuff." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back down at his papers. But he turned the whiteboard on his desk so the blank side faced her rather than toward him. She couldn't have explained why that felt like an act of kindness. Maybe it was just coincidence. She went back to the shelves and decided it wasn't. There were other moments she didn't mean to have. One afternoon she sat in the armchair across from him while he slept, or appeared to sleep, and said quietly to the room, "I know you probably don't understand most of what I say to you, but you're honestly the easiest person I've had to talk to in years, which is a bit ridiculous, given the circumstances." On another evening she said goodnight at his door and did a small, self-conscious wave she immediately wished she could take back. She didn't see his face. She didn't know he'd been watching from the angle of the window, or that something had shifted behind his expression at the small honesty of it. He heard everything. And for the first time in a long time, something in his chest was paying attention. Duncan Hale arrived on a Wednesday unannounced, carrying a briefcase and a smile that had been practiced on many people before Fraser. Brynn was making tea in the kitchen when she heard the front door, then voices. Well, one voice, since Fraser only had the one. She came to the hallway quietly. Duncan was already moving toward the study, talking in a smooth and reassuring tone about the quarterly report and the Berard project and how everything was completely under control. Not to worry. She watched Fraser watch him. Fraser's face gave nothing away. But Brynn had spent a week reading that face, and she noticed the small tightening around his eyes she associated with something he didn't like. Duncan set a folder on the desk. "Just a few signatures," he said. "Standard stuff, nothing complicated. The board wants to move forward and we need your authorization." Fraser looked at the folder. He reached for it slowly and opened it to the first page. "You don't have to read the whole thing," Duncan said, too casually. "I've gone through it." Brynn took 2 steps forward and knocked her shoulder hard into the doorframe, sending her mug sloshing. "Oh, sorry." She stepped into the room, dabbing at her sleeve, and managed to get her hand near the desk in the process of fussing, and the folder slid to the floor, pages fanning across the hardwood. "For goodness sake," Duncan said. "I'm so sorry." Brynn crouched and gathered the pages without particular speed, shuffling them into an order that was not the original order. "I'll get out of your way. I'll get fresh tea." She stood and left. In the hallway, she pressed her back to the wall and breathed. She'd seen the first page. She'd seen enough to read the words "power of attorney." And she'd seen Duncan's handwriting on a sticky note in the margin. "Once this is signed, we move forward with the Hale Group transfer." She didn't know what the Hale Group was. She knew the expression on Fraser's face when he'd reached for that folder. She knew those two things together were enough. That night, after Mrs. Pelletier went home and the house settled, Brynn sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and searched the Hale Group. It was a holding company, filed 8 months ago, Duncan Hale, sole director. She stared at the screen for a long time. The next morning, she put a mug of coffee on his desk and said quietly, "I don't know if this is my business. I'm fairly sure it's not. But I looked up the Hale Group last night, and I think you should know it exists before you sign anything with Duncan's name on it." She left without waiting for a response. 20 minutes later, Fraser appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding his whiteboard. "How do you know that name?" "I saw it on a note in the folder when I gathered the pages. I didn't snoop. Well, I did look it up after, which is maybe snooping. I'm sorry if I overstepped." Fraser looked at her for a long moment. Then he erased the board and wrote, "You didn't." Brynn exhaled slowly. He tucked the whiteboard under his arm and returned to the study. She watched him go and thought, different kind of something, but still something. Portia came the following week. She arrived in the afternoon when Brynn was in the back garden with Fraser's daughter. A detail Brynn had been imperfectly briefed on, since apparently the 7-year-old was considered adjacent to household furniture. Pippa had appeared on the second day, small and quiet, reading a book in a chair too large for her, and Brynn had said hello, and the child had looked at her with Fraser's eyes and said hello back, and that had been the beginning of a friendship. Pippa was in the garden because Brynn had suggested it, and Brynn was in the garden because she found the inside of the house too quiet on clear days. And Fraser was in the garden because he'd followed at a distance, though he sat apart with a book of his own and pretended he hadn't. Portia came around the side of the house and stopped when she saw Pippa. "Oh," she said, "you're out here." Pippa said hi without enthusiasm and went back to her book. Portia looked at Brynn the way certain people look at anyone they didn't personally hire. "You must be the new aide." "Brynn Alcott, yes." "How's he doing?" "Making good progress," Brynn said pleasantly. Portia went inside. Through the glass doors, Brynn watched her go to Fraser in the study and close the door. Pippa turned a page of her book and said, without looking up, "She doesn't like me." "You don't know that." "She never talks to me." Brynn sits down next to her. "That's more about her than it is about you." Pippa considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old processing something large. "Does she love my dad?" Brynn thought about Portia's measuring look, the closed door, the way she'd spoken about the wedding, venue, invitations, as items on a task list. "I think," Brynn said carefully, "your dad has people in his life who care about him." She meant it as a redirect. As she said it, she realized she also meant it as a fact, and that she was one of those people, and the recognition of that sat in her chest like something warm and slightly alarming. Inside the study, Portia was talking about the wedding. The venue had been chosen. Invitations needed to go out. And then, scrolling through her phone without looking at him, she said, "Duncan thinks the power of attorney should go through before the ceremony, just to keep things clean. For the company." Fraser wrote on his whiteboard, "Why before?" "Simpler legally," Portia said. He watched her. She smiled with great practice. He wrote nothing else. She took that as agreement. He let her. After she left, he sat in the study for a long time. Through the window, he could see the garden, Brynn and Pippa side by side, Pippa pointing something out on her page, Brynn leaning over to look, then laughing at whatever she found there. He watched them. Pippa hadn't laughed like that since her mother died 2 years ago. Brynn found the recording by accident. She'd gone to the kitchen for water and heard voices in the study, low and urgent, and recognized Duncan's alongside Portia's. They were speaking like they'd forgotten the house had walls. She stopped in the hallway, took her phone out, pressed record and set it face down on the side table before walking past the door toward the kitchen, making deliberate noise with the tap and the cupboard. She collected her phone on the way back. That night she listened. "He can't run a company from a whiteboard, Portia. The board is already nervous. He signed nothing today. He will. The doctor said his comprehension might be affected. We just need to be patient. Once the POA goes through, we move the Berard contracts to Hale Group and the valuation shifts. 6 months, maybe a year. We negotiate a buyout. Fraser gets a comfortable settlement, and we're done." "And if he figures it out?" "He won't." Duncan's voice was almost gentle. "He can barely hold a conversation." Brynn sat very still in her small room at the end of the hall. She thought about Fraser watching his whiteboard, watching Duncan, watching everyone with those quiet, unhurried eyes that didn't miss anything. She thought, "I don't think you're right about that." She went to him the next morning and put her phone on the desk. "You should hear this," she said. He listened. She watched his face, the small controlled stillness that was his version of a reaction. When it finished, he looked at her. "I think they're planning to use the power of attorney to take control of the company," Brynn said. "And I think you already suspected something. I'm not telling you anything you haven't considered." He reached for the whiteboard. "How long have you been watching?" "Since the folder. Though honestly, I noticed something was off in the first week. The way they speak to you, like they've already decided something about you." He looked at the window, then back at her. "You could lose this job." "I know. Why are you getting involved?" She thought about it, honestly. "Because someone should be, and because you deserve people who are actually on your side." Fraser held the whiteboard for a moment, then set it down. He picked up a pen and wrote on a piece of paper, which he slid across the desk. "I need 2 weeks. Can you keep them from getting a signature?" "Yes," Brynn said. "I'm very good at spilling things." Something moved across his face that she almost recognized as a smile. The 2 weeks were not calm. Duncan came twice more with new versions of the documents. The first time, Brynn had a coughing fit so severe it required a glass of water and considerable general disruption. The second time, Fraser himself waved the papers away, pointed at his throat, his head gestured vaguely, and Duncan had to accept, with tight-edged courtesy, that today wasn't the day. In between, Brynn emailed the recording to Fraser's personal lawyer, a woman named Carol Nakamura, at an address Fraser had written for her without explanation. She spent the evenings in the kitchen with Pippa, who had started appearing at dinner with the reliability of someone who'd learned the schedule. They made quesadillas and debated whether hot chocolate counted as a beverage or a meal. And Pippa told her about school, and Brynn told her about Jess, and the house became warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the furnace. Then one evening an envelope arrived for Brynn. Inside was a referral letter to a specialist at BC Children's Hospital. The waiting list bypassed, the appointment confirmed, Jess's full name on the file. No return address, no note. Brynn stood in the hallway with the envelope and looked at the closed study door for a long moment. Then she knocked. Fraser looked up. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He picked up the whiteboard. "How's her prognosis?" Something in Brynn's throat tightened in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Better with the right specialist, which she now has." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you." He set the whiteboard down without writing anything. Brynn went back to the kitchen and stood over the sink, with her eyes closed, and tried sensibly to think clearly about the fact that she was employed here. That none of this was what it felt like. She was not particularly successful. On the evening of the 14th day, Duncan and Portia arrived together. Fraser had asked Mrs. Pelletier to prepare the dining room, a written request, unusual enough that Mrs. Pelletier had asked him twice to confirm. And when Duncan and Portia walked in, a table was set, and Carol Nakamura was already seated at it with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she had listened to that recording more than once. Duncan stopped in the doorway. Portia said, "What is this?" Fraser stood at the head of the table. He did not pick up his whiteboard. He said, in a voice roughened by disuse but unmistakably his own, "Sit down." The room went very still. Duncan's face moved through several things quickly. "You can speak," Portia said. "Since Wednesday," Fraser said. "Sit down." They sat. Carol Nakamura opened her briefcase. What followed was not a shouting match. Fraser didn't raise his voice, which turned out to be more alarming than if he had. He laid out what he knew in the even, unhurried tone of a man who had spent weeks with nothing to do but listen, and had listened exceptionally well. The Hale Group. The Berard contracts. The board meetings arranged behind his back. The conversations held in rooms they'd assumed he couldn't make sense of. Duncan tried to interrupt twice. Fraser said no both times and kept talking. When he finished, Carol Nakamura handled the legal portion, which was detailed and not kind. Portia reached once for Fraser's arm in a gesture of old familiarity. He moved his arm without looking at her. "You'll want your own lawyers," Fraser said. "Not mine. You'll want them before tomorrow morning." He stood. "Mrs. Peltier will see you out." They left. The dining room was quiet. Fraser stood at the window. Brynn, who had been in the corner so still she'd nearly disappeared into it, let out a long, slow breath. "Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday," he confirmed. He didn't turn around. "You spoke to Pippa first." A pause. "Thursday morning, early," she cried, "which I wasn't expecting." "She didn't tell me. I asked her not to. I needed 2 more days." Brynn nodded even though his back was to her. "Okay." He turned then. He looked at her across the room, and his expression was different from every version of it she'd memorized. Still controlled, but something under it was no longer staying put. "You stayed," he said. "Yes. You could have taken the recording to anyone, or done nothing. Either way was safer." "I know." "Why?" She had thought about this, on and off, for 2 weeks. The honest version was inconveniently simple. "Because when I told you about Jess, you actually listened. I haven't had that in a while." A pause, and then you found her a specialist without being asked, without making it a moment. That's the kind of person worth staying for. Fraser was quiet. "You talked to me," he said then, "for weeks, things you didn't have to say out loud." Brynn felt her face warm. "I thought you weren't." "I thought?" "I know what you thought." Something moved through his eyes. "I heard everything." The small wave at the door, the quiet admission in the empty room, the morning she'd said he was the easiest person she'd had to talk to in years. Every word. "Everything," she said. "Everything," he said. She looked at the floor, then back up. "Are you going to be strange about it?" "Probably," he said. "I'm told I'm not naturally easy." "I know. I've met you." He made a sound she'd never heard from him, a short, surprised laugh. Brynn smiled at it, despite herself, because she'd spent weeks wondering what he sounded like. When his guard came down, and now she knew, and it was better than she'd imagined. "Come have dinner," she said. "Pippa's been waiting." "Pippa knows." "She set the table with her good placemat," Brynn said. "The one with the orcas on it. Come have dinner." He followed her to the kitchen. Months later, after the lawyers had done their work and the Berard contracts had been returned to where they belonged, and Jess had met her specialist, and Pippa had started sleeping through the night again, Fraser stood on the back deck watching the water and thought about how much he'd almost missed. He'd lost his voice for 19 days and found something he didn't have precise language for yet, which he appreciated for the irony. Brynn came out with 2 mugs and handed him one and leaned against the railing beside him. "Jess wants to apply to UBC," she said. "Of course she does." Is that a supportive "of course she does" or a commentary one? "It's an I'll make a phone call, of course she does," he said. Brynn looked at him. "Just a conversation, without mentioning her name. It's not the same thing." "You're impossible." "So I've been told." He looked at her sideways. "Stay anyway." She looked out at the water. The mountains were clear, sharp, and closed the way they get in November, snow coming down to the tree line. Inside the house, Pippa and Jess were arguing cheerfully about something, their voices carrying through the glass. And it occurred to Brynn that a house that used to feel too quiet for one person now couldn't hold all the noise 2 kids generated, and that this was, without question, an improvement. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He put his hand over hers on the railing, and she turned her palm up to hold it. and they stood there while the light changed on the water, and neither of them needed to say a single word more. What did you think of Fraser and Brynn's story? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a story.